Whoops, whoops, whoops. I made that mistake.
If it's, can I ask you a question?
Yes, go.
Is it a split screen?
Yes.
Great, that's what I want to know.
Yep. Cool, this is live now. So if you felt so inclined to go and get a bite to eat, you're welcome.
Give you the comms,
Yeah, I'll take comms and I'll sit over there.
and I'll do that, or do you want me to get this going and you do
Oh, you know what? Once it's up and running, then we'll swap.
that? Cool. Yeah,
That's easier.
yeah, fine.
Probably the best show sounding video.
What's that?
Huh? What the fuck? Jackson did a tech check with one of the fringe shows we're doing at Gluttony today. Just wanted to see how it went.
Oh, is that with
Ryan's group.
Yeah.
I say Ryan's group. It's my group as well, but he's driving it.
We went into Gluttony last night,
Oh yeah.
and we also saw the line for the garden.
Yeah.
Ridiculous.
Hey, big.
Yeah.
Oh right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like you could walk straight in if you had a ticket.
Yeah. I've only ever gone
Yeah.
with the tickets.
If you don't have a ticket, it's pretty much half of that street. You know that.
Yeah.
Like it was all full of people.
Whereas nobody goes to Gluttony. The kids don't go to Gluttony.
Yeah.
It's so
Gluttony
good.
was great. You literally just throw
Yeah.
your back and walk
I
straight
forgot.
in.
Yeah. I don't know why. Like Gluttony is just so much better than the Garden for the last couple of years. It's quieter, but the art's
have
better.
changed much. Like the layout and that kind of stuff.
I think Gluttony changes a bit. It gets a bit bigger and bigger. As the Garden that's been the same for.
Apparently their max is 12,000 people
Yeah. Right.
at Gluttony. The band size.
Okay.
Yeah.
Still not bad. I think the max here is 4, and I don't believe that. It's for rather than Turnbull yesterday. That was an easy 6,000-7,000 people. Easy.
It was packed everywhere.
Yeah. For that session.
Yeah.
Outside of that, it's just... Actually, this must be a popular one because there's a lot of people there. Or are they just avoiding the sun? They're just avoiding the sun. Never mind. They don't actually want to be there. Do you reckon I've got a few minutes? No, I don't. Never mind. I was going to go bathroom.
Well,
Sky's calling me. Fuck, why are you calling me? Sky! Good, how are you? I just saw that. That's not... stick in the walkway.
Okay, everybody, good afternoon. And I can get you to take your seats. There's been a lot of very good rumbling about this session this afternoon, so much so that we had an earthquake through Adelaide this morning in anticipation. My name is Rick Sarre, and it's my pleasure to be your chair this afternoon for this session on this beautiful, beautiful March afternoon in Adelaide here. We welcome you all. We welcome all those people watching on live stream around the state, and we thank all those institutions and libraries for allowing this to occur in this technological age. We thank, of course, the Writers' Week staff, and I want to thank and acknowledge Chelsea and Jade, who are going to be our Aslan interpreters this afternoon. So before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we meet on the Carra Wirra Parry banks, the banks of the River Torrens, known as the River Torrens since only 1836. Known as the Red Gum Forest River, where for more than 1,000 generations, Kaurna people, Kaurna men, Kaurna women and Kaurna children gathered exactly as we are doing now on the banks of the river to share stories, to learn from each other and to engage in storytelling. And it's quite remarkable that 50,000 years of that is being replicated here this afternoon. We acknowledge the spirituality of the Kaurna people in the way in which their elders, past, present and emerging, still see this as a significant part of their lives. We respect that, we acknowledge it and we celebrate that. Just some quick little housekeeping. Please turn your phones to silent. If you are tweeting, the hashtag is #ADLWW. Afterwards, copies of the two books we're talking about this afternoon will be available in the tent. And please be COVID safe. Follow the messaging on the screens and in the gardens and the directions of the wonderful green-shirted volunteers who are all around. And I'm acknowledging here, that's actually Kaurna for the acknowledgement of country. I've not seen it in Kaurna before. That's magnificent. So once again, the Writers' Week organisers are doing themselves proud. Today we're looking at two books. We have the works in what's known as a session called Words from the Wise of Peter Doherty and Barry Jones. Peter Doherty's book is entitled An Insider's Plague Year, which takes readers on a fascinating journey as the pandemic unfolded. And Barry Jones, whose book is What Is to Be Done, Barry tells me that there's no question mark in what is to be done deliberately. Barry's not asking the question, he's telling you what is to be done. He's mapping that plan. So if I were to introduce them with all of their achievements, we wouldn't have time for any dialogue today. So let me say simply that Professor Peter Doherty is a Nobel laureate, experimental pathologist and viral immunologist based at the University of Melbourne, who is still thinking, writing and working. Dr. Barry Jones, Australia's most celebrated polymath, who is clearly still thinking, writing and working, was a state and federal politician for 26 years, including Minister for Science through most of the Hawke years, 83 to 90. Both are companions of the Order of Australia, and both are joining us virtually today from Melbourne. Please welcome Peter and Barry. And there they are on the screen. This is remarkable. Fantastic to see you, gentlemen. Peter, let me start with you and looking at your book. After narrating in your book the history of immunological research in Australia, your book's focus is on the weekly postings that you did throughout 2020 into 2021 on the COVID trends and issues as they unfolded. You describe the virus as very scary and say every sane person should try to avoid it. Why is COVID-19 virus so scary?
Well, the COVID-19 was scary because our only precedent in any major sense was the SARS outbreak in China and East Asia, and it did get to Toronto of 2002, 2003, where about 10% of people were dying. So this was a new virus. The same family probably came by the same route from bats via a live animal market to people. And it was spreading very, very fast. And we didn't know really what we'd be doing with. In fact, I tended to underrate it a bit early on. It's much more complicated than I thought. And, I'm 81 years old. I'm no longer running a research lab, but I've been writing a lot. So I decided my role would be science communication. And as viral immunity is my field, that's what I've worked on for more than 50 years, I thought what I could start out doing is trying to explain it, what happens to people in comprehensible language. It's a very, very complicated area of science. And so I started writing a series called Setting It Straight, which went up on our website. And the book has 1 to 42 in it, I think, and I'm now due to write 96.
Peter, you highlight on a number of occasions through the book the value that we celebrate here in Australia on having a strong and well-funded public health system. You write, quote, "What is encouraging is that Australian politicians," and we're coming to Barry a bit later on this, Australian politicians who generally seem to be not much interested in science have listened to evidence-based views and have in the main done the right thing. Do you still hold to that in 2022?
Yes, I do. I think our response, and we should thank our politicians from both sides of the political spectrum, and state and federal. There have been disagreements between them. They are politicians. Scientists disagree too. But basically, they've done the right thing. The precedent was actually set when Barry was a minister in the Hawke government, and we confronted AIDS. And basically, what happened is we got bipartisan policy. We haven't seen that in Canberra, but we've seen it across the various state administrations with Canberra. We had bipartisan policy, and we dealt with it on the basis of evidence. They've listened to their chief medical advisors or their chief health officers and considered the political implications, then acted accordingly. And it's certainly the case that many, many, many fewer Australians have died than would have done so if they had not done that. If we'd followed the same path as the United States, just on numbers alone, we would have had at least 60,000 deaths from COVID, and we're much below that number.
Well, that's a wonderful segue to throw to Barry for this next question. Barry, you were the longest-serving Australian Minister for Science, and you note in your book on many occasions that pseudoscience is now very much dominating social media. You lament that our politicians have failed to keep up with the science-based momentum. So we have pseudoscience and a lot of ignorant politicians. What went wrong?
Well, in fact, it's a very complex situation that really relates to the proliferation of access to material. Once upon a time, say a generation or two back, if you wanted to find out about something very complex, well, you generally had to ask an expert, and an expert would come out and say, this is the explanation of so-and-so, and you'd read it in a kind of filtered way when it appeared in the newspapers or on television. Now, because of the miracle, in inverted commas, of universal access that's been created by the information revolution, you don't need to ask somebody else. You can find it out for yourself, find out your own sources, and then make your own opinions. So we've got a situation now, which is unprecedented, where opinion is more important than evidence. And the point is, if you hear somebody on the bus who says ivermectin is a terrific way of treating, of preventing the impact of COVID, you say, well, that's an interesting point of view. Why shouldn't I accept that as being a rational explanation of how we do it? It's pretty good on parasites. Maybe it'd be good on viruses as well. So in other words, if somebody comes along with that, you don't go to Doherty for advice about whether to go for ivermectin or not. You say, I've made up my own mind. And that's what freedom involves. And this is why, at the moment, we've got an extraordinary situation where we've got, for example, the United Australia Party, Clive Palmer, and the irrepressible Craig Kelly are banging on all the time about freedom. And what that means essentially is, if you decide from your point of view that 2 and 2 equals 5, well, what's wrong with that? In a free society, you're entitled to have any opinion that you want, even if we'd regard it as absolutely loopy. So the problem is that at the moment, you can see that there's a tremendous appeal to people who feel alienated by the advice given to them by elites. And one of the common elements that you find in Trump, and I'd have to say Scott Morrison as well, is that sense that people resent deeply the idea of condescension, that that there's a hierarchy of learning, and in that hierarchy of learning, you have people who say, look, what would you know about this subject? I've studied it for years, I'm an expert, and let me tell you, my opinion's worth 100 times more than yours is. But then, come to think of it, think of the democratic paradox. We accept without too much challenge as part of the democratic theory to say all votes are of equal value. Now, does that mean that all opinions are of equal value? And after all, the way in which you vote is determined by opinion. So in other words, you've got that paradox to say, yes, we accept that every vote is of equal value and should be of equal value. That's why we have equal electoral districts. But on the other hand, when it comes to saying there's a profound difference between some opinions are valid, and we know they're valid because they're people who've generally gone through higher education. And something that actually Timothy Garton Ash, the English political philosopher, made a very profound observation. He said that one of the unexpected consequences of the tremendous explosion in university, people going to universities, has been that instead of bringing society together, to some extent it's fractured it, so that you've got two classes. You've got, in Australia at the moment, you've got 7.5 million graduates living in Australia, but that means you've got a significant number of people who are not. And if you say, well, the university-trained people have a tendency to be condescending, then you can alienate the remainder of the community very powerfully. And that's happened at its most dramatic, of course, in the United States with the Trump phenomenon. But we've got echoes of the Trump phenomenon here. Now, look, I'm sorry, I've answered that question at excessive length, and I'll stop now and we can take it up later. But it's the central problem.
Barry, we are going to take that up a bit later when we talk about the fact that we have a much brighter population than we've ever had before, but seemingly disengaged with the political process. I do want to come back to that. But another quick question before we go back to Peter, and that is that in your book, you say the pandemic has actually highlighted how transactional the government has become. Rather than liberal, it's rather illiberal, and you say that some ideological sacred cows have been put down during the pandemic. Can you deal with one or two of those?
Oh, well, look, there was a period of some hope, I must say, at the very beginning of the pandemic, when it looked as if for a brief period that it would not be politics as usual. There'd be a completely different approach, and they'd take on board issues that are of scientific concern, not only, of course, COVID, but climate change as well. But oddly, there's always been a difference in our political thinking. It's easy to get politicians and public servants and lobbyists and so on to be sympathetic about medical research because all of us have got mothers, all of us have got siblings, all of us have got children or grandchildren. And the appeal to say, look, you can save a child, you can save a partner, you can save a husband, wife from some debilitating illness or something that causes death, it's easy to get response there because the response is not only is personal and it's immediate or very short term. When you're looking about an issue like climate change, with all the scientific combinations and permutations involved in it and its complexity, and you say, how long will it be before it's irreversible? And if the answer is to say, well, probably another decade, you say, well, look, there'll be 3 elections between now and then. You couldn't put off dealing with COVID for 10 years, but in the case of climate change, well, look, other nations aren't performing very well. Why should we hold ourselves out and lose valuable export income? Let's postpone the whole consideration. But now, and the sacred cows that they knocked off was the idea that there were 3, that the growth was an end in itself. I mean, any cancer specialist will say there's a dubious metaphor there, but all growth is good. The second, that if you give the rich more money, you encourage them, and if you give the poor more money, then they'll work less. That's extraordinary, a part of it, and also the budgets just have to be balanced, irrespective of whether you're buying submarines or going to have to, refit the nation's infrastructure. That's all. And in fact, unless you ask for more taxation, which both major parties are reluctant to do, they've abandoned the principle of progressive education, then you're stuck. But in fact, after a comparatively few months, after they made that initial decision to close the borders, to cut out international travel, which did seem far-sighted, then complacency came in and they said, look, we're ahead of the game. We cut off international travel. We'll protect ourselves in Fortress Australia. We'll be okay. And that meant that instead of leading in the pack, we became rather slow. Now we've caught up, of course, with the range of vaccination. We're among the most highly vaccinated nations on Earth, but we were very, very slow. And that's why, the ScoMo is no longer called ScoMo, but now slow-mo, which is simply quite appropriate.
Peter, I want to come back to you looking again at this whole idea of misinformation. One of the bits of misinformation that seems to have been certainly highlighted in your book is the understanding that we shouldn't be having vaccines because we just don't know enough about their long-term viability. Can you take us through that piece of misinformation about whether or not vaccines can never be safe until we have known something about their long-term effects?
Well, we didn't have time, as Barry said. We're facing a crisis, and you've got to put it in the background that there's been a very, very substantial anti-vaccination movement running across the planet for some years now. Something we weren't dealing with 20 or 30 years ago. It's really taken off. And part of it is this democratisation of information and the view that opinion outweighs evidence. Now, science communication, it has to be about trying to show, not tell. Top-down is a disaster. So I've been basically doing science communication. Now, with respect to the vaccines, we moved really fast to 2 new vaccine technologies, one of which had been around quite a while, what we call the adenovirus vectored vaccines, but had never been put out there en masse. The only place that had actually been used is with Ebola. That was the AstraZeneca vaccine. And the other is, of course, these new mRNA vaccines, which had been developmental work, had been going on for a couple of decades, but they'd never come near to actual practical use in humans. And it's the mRNA vaccines that, of course, have been the great triumph. But it's a completely new technology. And there's all sorts of misunderstanding and misinformation out there about these vaccines. So basically, an old friend, a man called Bill Hildebrand, who actually worked at Merck, developed a lot of the major vaccines, measles, mumps, and so forth that we use, said that he was never really happy until after those clinical trials where they test the vaccine in 20, 30,000 people, it had been into 3 million people. Well, these vaccines have now been into hundreds of millions of people. And we do know that there are some issues. We knew about the ones with the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is still being widely used across the planet because it's much better to be vaccinated than to be infected. And we've known of some issues with the mRNA vaccines. But they've been remarkably good vaccines, both of them, in fact. And basically a lot of people are alive who would otherwise be dead because of them. But that doesn't stop the background noise because now everything is interconnected. And that's just the reality that we have to live with. It gives people like me advantages. I mean, I use Twitter a lot. I'm writing an online blog that goes out every week. I don't know who reads it, but it's going out. And there's great communication systems. But it also allows disinformation and doubt and fear to take over and to be disseminated. And there's crazy stuff out there. I've been sort of assured. I'm regularly told that I'm a crook and that I'm being paid by Pfizer, I'm being paid by Merck, I'm being paid by the Gates Foundation and by the Chinese Communist Party, which is a bit hard to reconcile because I don't talk to any of them. But there are a lot of people out there who simply believe that nobody ever does anything from good intention or from a sense of professionalism. It's really a very odd world. I'm learning a lot about human beings, but I'm not sure I needed to know all of it.
Can I get you to clarify another term that has caused a lot of misinformation, I think, and that is herd immunity. Is that a policy worth pursuing or something we should be avoiding?
It was used to refer to the idea that if we got enough people infected, we'd be okay. Unfortunately, you have to be infected self and get sick and or die, depending on what your age, particularly in this particular infection. Herd immunity is an idea that's been around forever. It's basic to the idea of vaccination, really, is to set up herd immunity by vaccination rather than infection. And so we're kind of, the idea was, though, laissez-faire, let it rip. And where that happened, it was catastrophic. We saw it in some of the South American countries, for instance, particularly Brazil. And a bit of a tendency there on the part of some of the more right-wing governments, but not totally. And they actually soon backed off on the whole. Sweden was always held up as an example. They kind of backed off. So basically, we are now, I hope we're approaching something like herd immunity from basically large numbers of people across the planet having been infected and large numbers of people in countries like ours being vaccinated. But the virus has changed a lot. People who've been infected before are being infected again. People who've been vaccinated are being infected. Currently, the situation is with Omicron. It's a lot different from the protein, the spike that's being used in the vaccine as far as the antibody response is concerned. Doesn't protect particularly well against being infected. But the other component, the T cell component, which knocks off the virus-infected cells and brings the infection to an end, is pretty similar for what's in the spike and what Omicron uses. So people, the general thing is the vaccines are helping to keep people out of hospitals, helping to keep them out of ICUs. And Omicron itself is less virulent. We hope it's the last virus, but we don't know that, unfortunately.
Barry, I want to come back to that point you were making before, the paradox of us being better educated but less engaged. Let me quote from the book here. You were talking about the massive shift towards tertiary qualifications that began 40 or 50 years ago. And then you asked, quote, why are our brightest and best disengaged from major causes? Why has the political discourse, quote, fallen to historically low levels? So there's a paradox. We seem to know a lot more, but somehow or other we're just becoming disengaged. Now, I think you've already foreshadowed where that's coming from. Can you take us through that particular observation, which I should say in your book you make a number of times, the disengagement?
Well, going back, I think, to part of the problem is the changed nature of the universities. Where once, I mean, when I went to the university first, Melbourne University only had about 8,000 or 9,000 students, and that was regarded as one of the biggest universities in Australia. Now, there's a time when we've had more than 1 million undergraduates and postgraduates in universities in Australia, very, very much bigger. But two things have happened. First of all, the nature of the university has changed. The universities have essentially become trading corporations, and you find that there are more deputy vice-chancellors, management in brackets, than there are, in many cases, actual researchers. And that's a problem. But they see themselves as essentially an organisation which has to deal with the existing capitalist world rather than transform it, and needs to have an enormous flow of money coming in, apart from the money that they get from government. And I think it's tended to make their concentration, in a sense, practical and aimed at practical outcomes, rather than looking at the speculative about the longer term, about how individuals can change society. I came across a very good quotation, and I'll just inflict it on you for a moment, from the English philosopher A.C. Grayling in his book, The Frontiers of Knowledge. And he said this, I think this is very profound. He said, higher education has undergone a remarkable reversal. It has gone from having general literacy as its goal, leaving special expertise to form itself later as the outcome of individual interest and experience, to inculcating special expertise as its goal, leaving general literacy to form itself later as the outcome of individual interest. The reversal occurred without a halfway house, like a switch being thrown. And I think what happens is we've got a number of super specialists who then go out and say, I'm going to make my career, and then after that, I might speculate about what I can contribute to the world generally, and perhaps political engagement specifically in Australia. And of course, they never do. They become more and more expert in the area. This is why Peter is really, because of his capacity to explain, and to show rather than tell, as in why he's so valuable. Why Gus Nossal in an earlier period they were terrific communicators, wonderful communicators. We were very grateful for them. But a lot of specialists do not see themselves as public intellectuals. They're concentrating internationally on a particular specialised area, and that's as far as it takes them. And I think they see enough of politics to find it repellent, and they don't want anything to do with it. They turn up to vote with pegs on their noses every 3 years, and once they've done it, they say, we don't want anything more to do with it. I mean, the thing that I constantly wrote about in the book was to reflect we've got 15 million Australian voters. But if you take the number of people who take a slight, reasonably active role in parties, probably most of them actually alive, they wouldn't be more than 30,000. So in other words, you've got 99.8% of the population say, well, we go along with the democratic process, we vote, we want one government in rather than another political persuasion. But as for being involved in the entrails, count me out. I don't have anything to do with it. And so that disengagement is something that both major political parties actually encourage. The last thing they want to do, is to have floods of people coming in, asking impertinent questions, saying, why aren't you doing something better on climate change? Why aren't you doing something better about the care of the aged? Why aren't you doing something about having a taxation policy that actually does reflect the needs of not just this community, but the community 10, 15, 20 years down the track? Why don't you have parties which are concerned with global issues? And so we've lost the capacity to debate. I mean, one of the most appalling things, and I've certainly said this in the book, is that when you go to the Commonwealth Parliament and look at the subjects that they haven't been debating, and I've got a list which is so extraordinary. The last debate in the House of Representatives on science and research was in 1989. The last one on involvement in war was 1991. The last one on arts and culture, 1995. The last time on the Republic, 1998. On human rights, 2001. Foreign policy, 2003. I mean, this sounds like satire, but it's the reality. Governments tend to regard the meetings of the Parliament as just a nuisance. And they don't have serious debate. What happens is that a member might be highly qualified in terms of having a university degree rather than life experience, but they hand the member a piece of paper with a whole number of dot points and say, just read the dot points, and that's it. And if they lift their eyes and bring in something of their own, they're disciplined. So the political process has become extremely repellent, and that's exactly the way the major parties want.
Barry, that is a lament that summarises a lot of your book. That was a beautiful summary, but I should say to the audience here, when it does say what is to be done, there is a note of hope at the end. Don't think that's just basically a lament that Barry leaves you with. I do want to say to both of you gentlemen that you've both tackled this issue of climate change. I'm going to go to you, Barry, first, since you just raised it again, and then I'll come back to Peter. Barry, in your book, you say, and coming back to viruses, the impact of viruses, quote, is closely related to climate change. Habitat destruction from a warming planet brings animals physically closer to us with all their viruses attached. So we now have a link to climate change through the virus. You address this issue strongly near the end of your book. What is to be done about those issues?
Well, it's a combination of problems. First of all, the destruction of habitat means that we're getting closer and closer physically with growing population. The physical gap between where the animals are and live their own lives in their own remote habitat and human interaction is getting closer and closer. And it's also true that in some countries, and I suppose we've got to identify China in this, that you have in fact the production of the use of raw meat from species which are vectors of serious disease are now being consumed and sold in those wet markets. So that's why the great controversy about what happened in Wuhan. But it's a phenomenon that's going to occur unless we recognise that first of all, we've got to think very seriously about the way in which we organise human habitation. The move towards the growth of mega cities with their capacity for heat generation and their complete dependence on cheap volumes of fuel which have to be brought in. In the short term, it looks like, in China, you can see the emphasis is still on coal and will be probably for another decade or so. But you've got those two things, interaction, the destruction of the habitat, getting closer and closer to animals who maybe are carriers of viruses, which we're then exposed to. So that's one of many dangers. But of course, that's an area that Peter's far more expert in than me.
Peter, can I come back to you if you want to say something on what Barry said about climate change? You addressed that in your book as well.
Yeah, climate change and health, we talk about it all the time. The problem with climate change and health is it affects every aspect of human life, quite frankly. So that if you go to politicians with it, they just say, well, this is everything. But what we need right through government, right through policy, right through our regulation process and everything is basically a consideration of the climate change effects and, say, livability of buildings. We're constructing buildings that are not designed to resist the effects of increasing heat and climate change. So we can have that working through the whole system. The government has responded well to COVID, and they've done that through the advice of the chief medical officer. We need a chief climate scientist, but don't expect that to happen very soon. So basically, it's a very complex and multifaceted problem. With respect to the global distribution of viruses, particularly with respiratory viruses like COVID, the coronaviruses are all respiratory viruses in humans that we worry about. Before 2000, we had 2 of them circulating in us. They were called human coronaviruses, common cold coronaviruses. They've been around and we've known about them for decades. Since the year 2000, 5 new ones have crossed into humans. The SARS originally, one called MERS from the Middle East, goes from bats to camels to people, and CoV-2, and 2 new common cold viruses. What's changed? Well, what's changed is population size has increased, but it's increasing prosperity in countries that have live animal and live bird markets. That's particularly China. Increasing prosperity that's led to people jumping on planes and going all around the planet. That's what gets these respiratory infections around the planet. Now, with climate change, we've just realised we've got what's called Japanese encephalitis in Victoria, okay? This is a virus that goes from mosquitoes. It's maintained in pigs. They're what's called a maintaining host. It multiplies both in the pig and the mosquito. Occasionally we get bitten and we can get viral encephalitis. Been around in the Pacific ever since I can remember, and basically now it's down on the Murray River. So this is possibly a consequence of climate change because we've been expecting mosquito populations and so forth to move away from the equator. We expect malaria that's in the, say, coastal cities in, say, Kenya, like Mombasa, will move up into the higher country as the world gets warmer. So that I'd attribute to have a good likelihood that climate change has been involved there. But, you know, all sorts of other implications. Climate change just impacts everything and every aspect of our life.
I'm going to get to that part of the session now where, in fact, both of you come up with something that we can hang our hat on in terms of a response to the lament and the malaise that typically your books have documented. Peter, let me ask you first. You say, as you say just now, there will be more viruses. You've said something which I think might have a little bit of controversy. You talk about designer molecules we might need to develop. You suggest that genetically modified organisms should be created in this fight. Now, that's going to create some degree of disagreement. Tell us about that aspect of science-based prevention.
Yeah, I'm not particularly pushing the idea of genetically modified organisms, but actual fact, many of the vaccines we've got, these are what we call the live attenuated vaccines, are genetically modified viruses. That wasn't a direct genetic modification. What happened was the viruses were passaged from cell to cell or from animal to animal, and they changed genetically in ways that made them less virulent and damaging for us. And so that describes the yellow fever vaccine, the mumps vaccine, the rubella vaccine, the polio vaccine, and so forth. They're genetically modified organisms simply by passaging them. There's been debate about with COVID, and nobody's done it. And that's because there are risks. You could look at the virus and you could damage it in various ways so it didn't multiply to high titers in us, and maybe it would make a very good vaccine. It's what we call a live attenuated vaccine. But there are risks there, and there are risks that we don't fully understand, and that's why it really hasn't gone forward. But that's part of the approach. Part of the approach to climate change is basically to modify plants so that they're more heat tolerant, or they can work in different ways. One of the big problems in say, African countries can be micronutrient deficiencies. We can supply those through genetically modifying plants. But this creates enormous hostility in the minds of some people because it's messing with nature and all the rest of it. So I'm tending to stay away from commentary in that area. But basically, now with mRNA, we'll be developing a lot of molecular-based strategies, not just for vaccines, but actually for treatments. And it's a very exciting area of research, I think, which will have enormous human benefit. We're going to be doing a lot of that in Victoria, in fact. And I think that's a move forward, because one of the things we have to do in Australia is transition away from this dependence on primary industries and digging stuff out of the ground and so forth. We've got to create new economic opportunities and new opportunities for us across the broad spectrum.
Barry, I want to go to your what is to be done. One of the pegs that you hang your hat on is so-called, as you call it, enlightenment thinking. Can you tell us about enlightenment thinking and why that might be a panacea?
Well, I had a chapter in the book about the Enlightenment. It was so extraordinary that when you reflect that in the 18th century, you had this extraordinary passion for knowledge. You can see that, for example, when Captain Cook sailed the east coast of Australia, it was part of the project to observe the transit of Venus. I mean, that was a very high-flown scientific endeavour. When they had what was the predecessor of vaccination, a thing called variolation, to try and prevent people from dying from smallpox. Of all people, Catherine the Great had somebody who went through the process of variolation. And that's 250 years ago. Nowadays, she would have said, oh, I'll look it up on the internet and I'll find a website that says do something else. But she was prepared to follow the advice that was offered by scientists. And so the result is that we're getting away from the idea of rational calculation. And I think we're getting away also from the idea of courage. I think one of the most disturbing things about Australian politics at the moment, and I think it could be changed really comparatively quickly, is the total lack of ambition, the total lack of courage, and I'd say, to use a phrase that Gareth Evans throws around a lot, we're moving away from decency. It's so extraordinary to find, although there's a kind of a religion, a revival of interest in religion and politics, you can see that it doesn't necessarily lead to decent outcomes. It doesn't lead, for example, to a more compassionate approach to asylum seekers, to refugees. And clearly, you can see, what's happening in the Ukraine, to mention only one example, and what happened with Afghanistan recently. You're going to have more refugees. And we say, well, just make sure if you come to Australia, you don't come by boat. If you come by boat, you can never settle. We can never show any compassion. That seems to me to be absolutely extraordinary and appalling. And if there's one thing in which both major parties are in lockstep, it's that issue. And the result is that this is a generation of anti-leaders. You've got, and in the case of Morrison in particular, I've got a list of them. You've got a list of a rejection of complexity, of modernity, of multiculturalism, of science, and of expert opinion. And I think in many cases, a rejection of decency too. But you then find that you've got an opposition which says, well, we don't want to offend anyone. Let's just concentrate on what the deficiencies of the government, and let's not offer any policies of our own, because if we do, somebody might criticise them. And so the last thing we want to do is have criticism. You know, it's extraordinary to reflect, going back to what Peter was saying before. If you go back to Donald Horne and his great book, The Lucky Country, a lot of people miss the irony of the title, but remember, that's a book that's been out for 57 years, and nothing has changed. We've still got this tremendous emphasis on saying we're a primary producing country, or, minerals, gas, and the rest. We're essentially that, and we import the clever stuff. And in fact, extraordinary thing, and I made a point of it in the book, which you will have noted, no doubt, that there's an international index that they bring out at Harvard about where countries are going with imports or exports, the kind of things that how much economically complex exports we have. And you find that Australia's fallen, it ranked in the world number 55 in 1995. By 2019, it's 86. We're going in the wrong direction. And that's deliberate. And both major parties are really very timid about climate change. This is a situation where the community as a whole is actually better informed and willing to take risks. And to some extent, it's in the hands of individuals to do something about it. Very tiny numbers can change outcomes. I mean, just to give you an example.
Short example, Barry.
Well, I was just going to say, extraordinary thing with Kevin Andrews, you see, he'd been the member for Menzies, a seat in Melbourne, for 30 years. He had over 50,000 primary votes in 2019. But when he was dislodged in a pre-selection battle, he could only find 111 people prepared to support him. You see, the point is you can change things with really tiny numbers. If the people who are watching us this afternoon were prepared to get up and get out and engage and say, go and work for the political groups and take an active role in the election and change that, they can change outcomes, even though their numbers are comparatively small. It's so ridiculous. Part of the strength of the factions which have taken over the parties is because the parties have enormous money coming in, tremendous influence of lobbyists, but in the end, the actual number of people involved is tiny, absolutely tiny. And it would be so easy to transform it. I'm not suggesting that this should be the age of the suicide bomber, but you can see people have got to be prepared to take very strong action, and they've got to get people out of their caves. We're not living in a secret society. Politics has got to be more open, and the more powerful decisions have got to be open, they've got to be transparent, and they've got to be decent.
Thank you very much, Barry. I was going to ask both of you for a takeaway. Barry, you've just given us yours, but I'm going to ask people to come to the microphone now if they want to ask a question. And I see some people coming to the line now. So very, very quickly, Peter, if you have a takeaway in 3 sentences, because I can see this line is emerging very quickly and very long, what would your takeaway be for this afternoon?
Yeah, I mean, my takeaway is basically it's up to us. And there are some big issues that we can't change without having political leadership. And climate change is one of those where you can't make the biggest change without having political leadership. So think very carefully about how you vote, look at the parties, look at the policies, look at the preference allocations and all the rest of it, and vote. That's really important. We're getting great movement from some of the wealthy people, of Twiggy Forrest, for instance, who's embracing green hydrogen and so forth. And we also have business now far ahead of government and actually trying to look at act on climate change. There's a misconception out there about the nature of freedom. I mean, the American experiment, if you like, the United States, defined by Jefferson, is really embedded in Enlightenment values and individual liberty. But there's a misinterpretation of what individual liberty stands for. It doesn't stand for liberty without responsibility. Take the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution, the right to bear arms. That's about the right to bear arms in an organised militia. It's the desire of the colonists not to have a standing army that can be used by a king to suppress them. It's the idea that we will have volunteers, as was the kind of military message at that time. There's a great misreading and dishonesty in the political process across Australia and across the planet, which is very distressing. But we have to go with it. It's our best opportunity. We're a democracy. We have to make that democracy work as best we can. So where I tweet on, I'm on Twitter and I'm an influencer. I've got more than 100,000 followers. Where I tweet on virus and immunity and all the rest of it, sometimes I get treated with respect. Sometimes, of course, I'm told I'm a monster. But where I tweet on other things, I'm told I'm an idiot. That's fine. I mean, I'm a Nobel Prize winner. You can be an icon if you become a Nobel Prize winner. But as Margaret Atwood defines it, an icon is like a statue in a park that has pigeons crap all over it. Much better to be annoying people.
Okay, we have about 8 minutes and 7 questions. So I'm going to ask the questioners to be very brief, and I'm going to do this. I'm not going to get both of you gentlemen to answer every question. I think that might just take too long. So if you wanted to direct your question to one of the gentlemen, that would work. Away you go.
Great. This is for Barry. In the book Ploughs, Plagues and Petroleum by Professor William Ruddiman, he says that we've emitted greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at such a rapid rate that the climate system hasn't truly responded yet. And Bruce Johansson calls it thermal inertia. Can you explain what inertia is?
The inertia is created, I think, by the fact that people say, I don't want to take immediate action unless somebody else takes the lead. If somebody else takes the lead and shows me how a transition can be made in a painless way that doesn't cost very much, well, I'll go along with it. But I'm not prepared to go out and actually take an active role or rather, I'd like to take an active role, but I don't think it'll do any good. And so the result is that people pull back and let the situation simply deteriorate. And that's the tragedy. And I think the future generation, if you're thinking ahead for children or grandchildren, they're going to look back and say, what happened to that generation who were active in the 2020s and saw a deteriorating situation, but failed to act on it.
Thank you. James.
Thank you very much. Peter, question for you, please. We knew very early on in the pandemic in 2020 that we were much more likely to die of COVID-19 if we had a chronic metabolic disease such as type 2 diabetes. So to me as a doctor, one of the best weapons we have is to improve our metabolic health. So why have we not heard this really important message from our government? Why have we not heard of the dangers of highly processed foods and sugary drinks in potentially reversing this disaster?
Yeah, I mean, that's very important, and basically it's a message that's a continuing message that has to be got out there. Unfortunately, there's a lot of confusing stuff around this, around wellness advocates and all the rest of it. I mean, one of the tragedies about Shane Warne's death is that he was on some sort of extremely severe diet regime, which may have been rather unwise. And so it has to be something that's curated by people who are professional and have a proper understanding. Advocacy groups can be enormously important in this, but as you know, getting information out there, and as a doctor, as you know, actually trying to induce behavioural change is an enormous problem.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Yes, we just had protest rallies in Canberra, and my son was part of those protests. I have been trying to dissuade him from being anti-vaccination. Can you give me some practical solutions, please?
Very quickly, Peter.
I wish I could. He could read my blog, all 95 of them so far, and maybe get some clues. But it's very hard to persuade people who are taking this position. But one thing, I think, point out to him, if he happens to have a tattoo, point out that the tattoo ink follows exactly the same path as the vaccine. It goes to the lymph nodes in our arm, and it'll stay there forever, whereas the vaccine's gone pretty quickly. I think we actually made a mistake in not having tattooists give vaccines.
My answer to that question is buy Peter's book. That's what I would do. Next question, please.
My question's for Barry. You're talking about how all of us should go out and get stuff done. We're all going to be dead in 10, 15 years, maybe a little more, looking at the gray hairs around here. What do we need to do in schools today? And I mean primary, kindy even. What do we need to do in schools today to teach them to be more critical thinking and to practice this leadership that we need tomorrow?
Thank you. Barry.
Well, it will not have escaped your attention that you're going to have a state election in South Australia, and you're going to have a federal election sometime probably in May, probably about the 18th of May. It could be later in the year if they split the elections and don't have an election for the Senate, but I think that's very unlikely. I think in the 2 months that go between now and election day, I think you ought to do all that you can to make the lives of candidates or prospective candidates miserable by challenging them on issues. I should explain something I've been involved in. John Hewson and I are both involved in activities to the disapproval of our parties that we've been members of for so long. And we've been involved in 3 organisations, one called the Truth and Integrity Project, which you can find on the web, but you've got to put in the first, the Truth and Integrity Project. Secondly, in Climate 200, which Simon Holmes of Court has been really pushing. And the third is the Accountability Roundtable, which is campaigning very vigorously to try and get a federal ICAC so that a lot of these major issues can be challenged and tested and so on. And so I think I was going to say, I've got a verbal Peter Doherty as well. I nearly said Doherty would agree with this, and I hope he would. But Hewson and I are really saying the 3 issues you've got to really look at are the climate change issue, the question of the exploitation of women, and the need for accountability. As it is, there's no commitment to truth. People just make stuff up. Now, you've got an extraordinary parallel with Trump, and you've got an extraordinary parallel now with Putin. Just to give one example, extraordinary where Putin talks about the history of Russia and says that the Ukraine was created essentially from Moscow. It's a kind of Moscow dependency. And if you look at Russian history, it's right the reverse. The Russian Orthodox Church, for example, began in the Ukraine and then spread out to Moscow. But the point is, in the case of politicians now, they simply make stuff up. And they'll make deniability of things where they've said that, they've made particular categorical statements. And then they say, I never said that. And when they're caught out, they say, oh, I can't remember having said it now. And that doesn't matter. And they're not held to account for accountability. And the result is that there's a far higher level of corruption in Australian public life than there was, say, 20 or 30 years ago. And they're exactly the sort of issues that people ought to be insisting that candidates give honest answers about.
Okay, we're going to do this. Very good. We have about 90 seconds to go. What I'm going to do is have both our last questioners just give their short question, and then I'm going to throw to one of our words from the wise gentleman to answer both of them very carefully. Away you go, sir.
The changes that we need on climate change are so great that I wonder if the action that we need is incompatible with both democracy and sovereignty.
Okay, that's a very interesting thought. We'll hold that one there. The last question, please.
My question is to Barry. It's actually a request. In under 3 minutes and preferably under 275 words, could you please tell us what is to be done?
I think this session has highlighted what is to be done from both the gentlemen, but would either of you like to tackle either of those questions in the last 30 seconds we have?
Well, the last one, I can do it in three words, or one if you like. Engage, engage, engage.
Yep, I'd support that.
Peter, do you have 3 words as well? Not a 3-word slogan, I hope.
Think it through. Connect the dots.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're right on time. Before I thank our gentlemen, words from the wise, please thank Chelsea and Jade, our Auslan interpreters. I want to thank all of our questioners, and to Peter Doherty and Barry Jones, please give your applause.
I could see hands moving.
Okay. Well, be well, Barry.
Okay. It was all right. I think we gave them what they wanted.
Yeah, I don't know.
I didn't want more of the point.
Well, they got what they got, so that's
Yep.
about all you can hope for. Okay.